Picture this. You spend 75 years building a life, creating memories, and nurturing relationships. You accumulate wealth beyond most people's dreams, $50 million to be exact. You raise 4 children who you believe will be your legacy, your comfort in your golden years. Then, in one devastating afternoon, you discover that to them, you're nothing more than a forgotten relic gathering dust in the corner of their busy lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elizabeth Flores, but everyone calls me Liz. I'm 75 years old, and I'm about to tell you the story of how I learned that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. This is about the day I made a decision that would shock my family to their core, and how that decision revealed a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about love, memory, and the bonds that tie us together. If you think you know where this story is going, trust me, you don't. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of my breakfast nook, casting delicate shadows across the mahogany table that had witnessed decades of family meals. I sat there with my coffee, still warm in my favorite porcelain cup, the one with tiny pink roses that my late husband Marcus had given me for our 25th anniversary. The silence in my Pacific Heights mansion was different that morning. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of solitude I'd grown accustomed to in the 3 years since Marcus passed. This was the heavy silence of anticipation, thick with hope and nervousness. Today was the day I'd been planning for months. The annual Flores family reunion, a tradition I'd started 20 years ago when the children were still young enough to think spending time with their mother was something to look forward to, rather than endure. Every third Saturday in September, our sprawling San Francisco home would fill with laughter, conversation, and the kind of warmth that only comes when family gathers around the same table where they'd once fought over the last piece of birthday cake. I'd spent the previous week preparing everything myself, despite Maria, my housekeeper, insisting she could handle the arrangements. But this wasn't just any gathering. This was my chance to reconnect with my children, really connect, in a way we hadn't in years. I wanted every detail to be perfect, every moment to matter. The dining room table, which could seat 12 comfortably, was set with our finest china. The Waterford crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier above, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the white tablecloth. I'd spent hours the night before polishing each piece of silver, remembering the stories behind every serving, dish, every candlestick. The turkey was already in the oven, filling the house with the rich aroma that had once brought my children running to the kitchen, noses in the air, asking when dinner would be ready. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about each of my children, wondering what they were doing at that very moment. Were they getting ready? Were they looking forward to seeing me? To spending time together as a family? The questions swirled in my mind like the cream I stirred into my coffee. My eldest, Roberto, was 47 now, a successful cardiac surgeon in Los Angeles. He'd always been the serious one, even as a child. While his siblings were playing, Roberto would be reading medical journals I'd brought home from the hospital where I worked as a nurse before I started my own medical supply company. He'd married Sarah, a lovely woman who worked in hospital administration, and they had 2 teenage children I barely knew. The last time I'd seen them was at Christmas, and even then, Roberto had spent most of the time on his phone, fielding calls from the hospital. Then there was Carmen, my 44-year-old daughter who lived in New York. She'd followed in my entrepreneurial footsteps, though she'd chosen real estate instead of medical supplies. Carmen had always been the most independent of my children, determined to prove she could succeed without anyone's help. She'd never married, claimed she was too busy building her empire to worry about relationships. I respected her drive, but I worried about her loneliness, though she'd never admit to feeling lonely. My son Diego, 41, was the artist of the family. He lived in Portland with his partner James, and they ran a small gallery together. Diego had always been my sensitive child, the one who would bring me dandelions from the garden and cry when we read sad stories together. He'd struggled with his identity for years before finding the courage to live authentically, and I'd been proud of him for that courage. But success in the art world was unpredictable, and I knew he worried about money more than he let on. Finally, there was my youngest, Isabella, 38, who lived right here in San Francisco with her husband and 2 young children. She worked as a marketing executive and always seemed to be juggling a million things at once. Isabella had been my surprise baby, born when I thought I was done having children. She'd been my shadow when she was small, following me everywhere, helping me with everything. Now she lived only 20 minutes away, but I saw her less than her siblings who lived across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd built my medical supply company from nothing, starting with a small loan and a determination to provide better equipment to hospitals and clinics. Over the years, it had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise with facilities across the West Coast. When I sold it 5 years ago, I'd walked away with more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. $50 million to be exact. $50 million that I'd planned to leave to my children, to ensure they'd never have to worry about money the way I had when I was young. But money, I'd learned, couldn't buy you the one thing that mattered most: time with the people you love. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, and I felt a flutter of excitement in my chest. They should start arriving soon. Roberto's flight was supposed to land at 10:30, and Carmen's had arrived the night before. Diego was driving down from Portland, and Isabella was just coming from across town. By noon, we'd all be together, and I could finally share the news I'd been holding close to my heart for weeks. I'd been thinking about selling the house, not because I needed the money, but because it felt too big, too empty, too full of echoes from a life that felt increasingly distant. I'd been looking at some lovely retirement communities, places where I could have my own space but also be part of a community. The idea both excited and terrified me. I wanted to talk to my children about it, to get their input, maybe even to hear one of them say they'd miss having the family home to come back to. More than that, I wanted to discuss what would happen to the bulk of my estate. $50 million was a lot of money, more than any one person needed. I'd been thinking about how to divide it fairly among my children, but I also wanted to set aside substantial amounts for charity. The children's hospital where I'd volunteered for years could use a new wing. The scholarship fund I'd established for nursing students needed more funding. There were so many causes close to my heart that could benefit from my good fortune. But first, I wanted to hear what my children thought. I wanted to know about their dreams, their plans, their hopes for the future. I wanted to understand what mattered to them so I could make decisions that would honor both their needs and my values. The doorbell rang at exactly noon, and my heart leaped. I smoothed my dress, a navy blue silk that had always been Marcus's favorite, and hurried to the door. Roberto stood on the front steps, looking distinguished in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, his dark hair now showing distinguished threads of silver at the temples. But he was alone. "Mijo," I said, reaching up to embrace him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was tall like his father, and I had to stand on my tiptoes to kiss his cheek. "Where are Sarah and the kids?" "They couldn't make it, Mom," he said, stepping into the foyer. "Sarah had a work thing, and the kids had plans with friends. You know how teenagers are." I felt the first small prick of disappointment, but I pushed it aside. Of course. I understand. Come in. Are you hungry? I've made all your favorites." Roberto followed me toward the kitchen, but I noticed he was checking his phone as we walked. "Actually, Mom, I need to tell you something. I can't stay as long as I'd planned. There's a situation at the hospital. One of my patients is having Complications from surgery yesterday, and I might need to fly back tonight. The disappointment grew a little sharper, but I forced a smile. Well, let's make the most of the time we have. The others should be here soon. Carmen arrived 15 minutes later, looking every inch the successful businesswoman in her tailored suit and designer heels. She air-kissed my cheek and immediately began apologizing for being late, explaining that she'd had to take a call from a client in Tokyo. She was beautiful, my Carmen, with the same dark eyes and strong jaw that had made her father so handsome. But there was a tension in her shoulders, a restlessness in the way she moved that suggested she was already thinking about the next thing on her agenda. "I'm so glad you're here," I told her, taking her hands in mine. "It's been too long." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Work has been insane. But I'm here now and I want to hear everything. How have you been? You look wonderful." We settled in the living room to wait for Diego and Isabella. Carmen perched on the edge of the sofa, her phone face up on the coffee table. Roberto stood by the window, occasionally glancing at his own phone. The conversation felt stilted, punctuated by long pauses and the kind of small talk you make with acquaintances rather than family. Diego arrived at 12:45, apologetic, and slightly frazzled from the drive. He looked more like me than his siblings, with my lighter complexion and slender build. His embrace was warm and genuine, and for a moment I felt the connection I'd been craving. "Sorry I'm late, Mama," he said, using the name he'd called me since childhood. "Traffic was terrible, and then I got lost trying to find parking. This neighborhood gets busier every year." "Don't worry about it, mijo. You're here now. That's what matters." Isabella was the last to arrive, rushing in at 1:15 with her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks flushed from hurrying. She hugged me quickly, then immediately launched into an explanation about her morning from hell. Her youngest had woken up with a fever, her husband was out of town on business, and she'd had to find a babysitter at the last minute. "I can only stay for a couple of hours," she said, already sounding apologetic. "The sitter can only watch them until 4, and I promised Tommy I'd be at his soccer game at 5. "Of course," I said, though my heart was sinking. Family first always. As we gathered around the dining table, I tried to recapture the vision I'd had of this day. The food was perfect. The turkey was moist and flavorful, the sides were all their childhood favorites, and I'd even made Roberto's favorite tres leches cake from scratch. But something was wrong. Everyone was there, but no one was really present. Roberto kept glancing at his phone, which he'd placed next to his plate despite my gentle suggestion that we keep the meal phone-free. Carmen was picking at her food, clearly preoccupied with something. Diego was the most engaged, asking about the neighbors and complimenting the meal, but even he seemed distracted. Isabella was wolfing down her food like she was racing against the clock, which I suppose she was. I tried to steer the conversation toward meaningful topics. I asked about Roberto's work, and he gave me a brief, clinical summary of his current caseload. I asked Carmen about her latest projects, and she launched into a detailed description of a commercial real estate deal that I didn't understand but tried to follow. Diego talked about a new artist they were featuring at the gallery, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm for the first time all day. Isabella shared funny stories about her children, and I treasured every detail, hungry for any connection to my grandchildren. But throughout it all, I felt like I was watching my family through glass. They were physically present, but emotionally, they seemed miles away. When I mentioned that I'd been thinking about selling the house, Roberto barely looked up from his phone. Carmen made a non-committal sound and asked if I'd considered the tax implications. Diego seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, asking if I was sure I was ready for such a big change. Isabella said it might be good for me to have less space to maintain, then immediately returned to checking the time on her phone. None of them asked where I was thinking of moving. None of them asked how I felt about leaving the house where they'd grown up. None of them seemed to realize that I wasn't just talking about real estate, I was talking about closing a chapter of my life, and I was scared. The conversation I'd been hoping to have about my estate planning never materialized. Every time I tried to bring up the future, someone's phone would ring, or someone would remember an urgent email they needed to send, or the topic would somehow shift to their own immediate concerns. By 2:30, Roberto was making noises about needing to head to the airport. Carmen was openly checking her phone, responding to texts with growing frequency. Isabella was gathering her purse and jacket, apologizing again about the babysitter and the soccer game. Diego was the only one who seemed reluctant to leave, but when the others started making their exit, he followed suit. This was wonderful. "Mom," Roberto said, giving me a perfunctory hug. "The food was delicious as always. We should do this more often." "Absolutely," Carmen agreed, though she was already halfway to the door. "Maybe next time we can plan it further in advance so everyone can stay longer." "Love you, Mama," Diego said, and his hug lingered a moment longer than the others. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Isabella kissed my cheek and promised to call soon, then hurried out to her car, her phone already pressed to her ear. And then they were gone. All of them. By 3:00, I was standing in my foyer, listening to the echo of car doors slamming and engines starting, watching through the window as the last of my children drove away. I walked back to the dining room, where the table still held the remnants of our meal. The turkey I'd spent hours preparing was barely touched. The sides I'd made with such care were mostly untouched. The tres leches cake sat whole and perfect, its 3 candles still waiting to be lit for the toast I'd planned to make. The silence that filled the house now wasn't the comfortable quiet of earlier that morning. This was the silence of abandonment, of hopes dashed and dreams deferred. This was the silence of realizing that the people you love most in the world see you as an obligation rather than a joy. I sat down in Marcus's chair at the head of the table and looked around at the empty seats. $50 million, I thought. All that money, all that success, all those years of building something to leave behind, and I couldn't even hold my children's attention for a single afternoon. The tears came then, hot and angry and full of a pain I hadn't felt since Marcus died. But this was different. When Marcus passed, I'd lost my partner, my love, my best friend. That had been grief for what was gone. This was grief for what had never really existed. The close, loving family I'd thought I had. The children who I'd believed valued me as more than just a source of inheritance. I thought about the retirement communities I'd been researching, the idea of selling the house and starting over somewhere new. Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea after all. Maybe it was time to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for my children to remember I existed. I thought about the $50 million sitting in my accounts, the estate plan I'd been so carefully considering. I'd wanted to leave my children secure, to give them a foundation that would let them pursue their dreams without financial worry. But what was the point of securing their futures if they couldn't be bothered to be part of mine? The anger surprised me with its intensity. I'd been making excuses for them for years. They're busy, they have their own lives, they're building their careers. But the truth was simpler and more painful. I wasn't a priority. I was a duty to be discharged as quickly and efficiently as possible. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky outside my windows in shades of pink and gold, I'd made a decision. I walked to my home office, a room lined with books and awards and photographs of the life I'd built. I sat at my desk, the same desk where I'd signed the papers to sell my company, and I reached for my phone. "Hello, Patricia?" I said when my estate attorney answered. "It's Elizabeth Flores. I know it's Saturday, but I need to schedule an appointment with you first thing Monday morning. I want to make some significant changes to my will." The conversation was brief and professional. Patricia Hernandez had been my lawyer for 15 years, and she'd handled the original estate planning when I'd sold my company. She didn't ask questions, just confirmed that she could see me at 9 o'clock Monday morning. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my office, surrounded by the mementos of a life well lived. Awards from medical associations, photographs from charity galas, a shelf full of books I'd collected over the years. On my desk was a framed picture of my children from years ago, back when they were young and still thought I hung the moon. I picked up the photograph and studied their faces. Roberto, serious even at 15, his arm around 13-year-old Carmen, who was grinning widely and missing a front tooth. Diego, only 10, was making bunny ears behind Isabella's head, while she, just 7, giggled at something off camera. They'd been my whole world then. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of what would be best for them. When had that changed? When had I stopped being their center and become their obligation? Maybe it was when Roberto went to medical school and became too important to come home for dinner. Maybe it was when Carmen moved to New York and started calling only on holidays. Maybe it was when Diego found his own family in James and stopped needing mine. Maybe it was when Isabella got married and had children of her own, making me a grandmother but somehow making me less of a mother in the process. Or maybe it had been a gradual thing, so slow I hadn't noticed until it was too late. The phone calls that became shorter and less frequent. The visits that became more dutiful and less joyful. The conversations that became more about them and less about us. I thought about the questions I'd wanted to ask them today. Not just about the house or the money, but about their lives, their happiness, their dreams. I'd wanted to know if Roberto was fulfilled by his work or if he missed having more time with his family. I'd wanted to know if Carmen was truly happy, living alone, or if she sometimes felt as lonely as I did. I'd wanted to know if Diego felt supported in his art, or if he worried about financial security. I'd wanted to know if Isabella felt overwhelmed by the demands of work and motherhood, or if there was anything I could do to help. Instead, I'd gotten polite small talk and distracted half attention, sandwiched between apologies for arriving late and excuses for leaving early. I placed the photograph back on my desk and made my way to the kitchen to clean up the remnants of the meal. As I wrapped the leftover turkey and stored the untouched sides in the refrigerator, I made a mental note to take most of it to the food bank tomorrow. There was enough to feed a family of 6 for a week, and it seemed wasteful to let it go bad just because my own family couldn't be bothered to stay long enough to eat it. The tres leches cake was the hardest part. I'd spent hours making it, layering the sponge cake with the perfect mixture of 3 milks, topping it with fresh whipped cream. It was Roberto's favorite, the cake I'd made for every one of his birthdays until he moved away. Now it sat there, untouched, a sweet symbol of effort unappreciated and love unreturned. I cut myself a small slice and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, tasting the familiar flavors of my childhood, of my mother's kitchen, of tradition and love and care. It was perfect, as I'd known it would be. Roberto would never know what he'd missed. As I cleaned the last of the dishes, I found myself thinking about Maria, my housekeeper, who had become more of a companion than an employee over the years. She was close to my age, a widow like me, and we'd developed a friendship that transcended the professional relationship. Maria always asked about my children, always seemed genuinely interested in their lives and accomplishments. She remembered their birthdays, their anniversaries, the names of their children. She cared about my family in ways that my family didn't seem to care about me. I thought about Dr. Janet Williams, my doctor, who had become a friend over the years. She always made time for my questions, always listened when I worried about my health or my future. She knew I was afraid of becoming a burden, afraid of losing my independence, afraid of being forgotten. She'd never once made me feel like my concerns were trivial or my time was unimportant. I thought about the volunteers I worked with at the Children's Hospital, people who gave their time and energy to help others without expecting anything in return. They showed up when they said they would. They stayed as long as they were needed. They remembered the small details that made people feel valued and cared for. These people, none of them related to me by blood, treated me with more consideration and respect than my own children had shown me today. The realization hit me like a slap. I'd been trying so hard to maintain relationships with people who saw me as a burden that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be around people who saw me as a gift. By the time I finished cleaning the kitchen, my mind was made up. Monday morning, I would sit down with Patricia and restructure my entire estate. The children's hospital that had given me so much purpose would receive a substantial endowment. The scholarship fund for nursing students would be fully funded for generations to come. The food bank where I volunteered would receive enough to expand their operations. The art center where Diego had once taken classes would receive a donation large enough to ensure they could continue providing opportunities for young artists. My children, who couldn't spare more than a few hours for the woman who had spent her life caring for them, would receive a very different kind of inheritance. Not the financial security I'd planned to provide, but perhaps a lesson about the true value of family, love, and time. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and made my way upstairs to my bedroom. The house felt different now, not empty, but cleared, like a space that had been decluttered and was ready for something new. I wasn't just planning to change my will, I was planning to change my life. For too long, I'd been waiting for my children to remember that I mattered. It was time to surround myself with people who already knew. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me feel hopeful about new beginnings. I dressed carefully in my charcoal gray suit, the one I'd worn to important business meetings during my final years running the company. It felt appropriate somehow, armor for the battle I was about to wage against my own expectations and disappointments. Patricia Hernandez's law office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building with views of the bay that on any other day would have lifted my spirits. Today, I barely noticed the sparkling water or the sailboats dotting the horizon. My mind was focused entirely on the task ahead, the conversation that would fundamentally alter the legacy I'd spent decades building. Patricia greeted me with the same warm professionalism she'd shown for the past 15 years. She was a woman about my daughter Carmen's age, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and the kind of steady presence that made people trust her with their most important secrets. Her office reflected her personality, sophisticated but comfortable, with family photos scattered among law books and legal awards. "Elizabeth, it's wonderful to see you," she said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table by the window. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about these changes you want to make. Your current estate plan is quite comprehensive." I settled into the chair across from her, placing my handbag carefully on the floor beside me. For a moment, I wondered if I was being hasty, if the pain of Saturday's disappointment was clouding my judgment. But then I thought about Roberto, checking his phone during dinner, Carmen's restless energy as she counted the minutes until she could leave, Isabella's hurried exit to attend to more pressing obligations. "Patricia, I've been thinking about legacy," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Not just the financial legacy, but what we leave behind in terms of values, relationships, and impact. I've realized that my current will doesn't reflect what I truly want to accomplish." She nodded, pulling out a legal pad and uncapping her pen. "Tell me what you have in mind." Over the next 2 hours, I outlined my vision for a completely restructured estate. The children's hospital where I'd volunteered would receive $20 million to build a new pediatric wing. The nursing scholarship fund I'd established would receive $10 million, enough to provide full scholarships to deserving students for generations. The food bank would receive $5 million, allowing them to expand their services throughout the Bay Area. Several other charities close to my heart would receive substantial bequests. As for my children, each would receive a trust fund of $50,000 and a letter explaining my decision. It wasn't nothing, but it was a far cry from the millions they were expecting. Patricia listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my intentions for specific donations. When I finished speaking, She leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of careful attention she usually reserved for reviewing complex contracts. Elizabeth, this is a significant change from your previous estate plan. I want to make sure you've considered all the implications. Your children will be shocked, and there may be legal challenges. Let them challenge it, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. I'm of sound mind, and this is my money to distribute as I see fit. I've spent too many years making decisions based on what I thought they needed rather than what they've shown they deserve. Patricia made notes as I spoke, her expression carefully neutral. I need to ask this, and please don't take offense. Are you making this decision in response to a specific incident or conflict with your children? I told her about Saturday's family reunion, about the hours of preparation that had gone unnoticed, about the meaningful conversations that never happened, about the early departures and constant phone checking. As I spoke, I could hear how it sounded like the complaints of a petulant parent who didn't get enough attention. But Patricia had known me long enough to understand that this wasn't about a single slight or momentary hurt. This isn't about revenge, I explained. It's about recognition. They've made it clear that their relationship with me is transactional, based on obligation rather than genuine affection. I refuse to reward that with a financial windfall they haven't earned through emotional investment. We spent another hour working through the legal details, discussing trust structures, charitable giving strategies, and the timeline for implementing the changes. Patricia explained that she would need to draft new documents, that everything would need to be properly witnessed and notarized, that there were tax implications to consider. I want this to be ironclad, I told her. No loopholes, no room for interpretation. And I want a video statement to accompany the will, explaining my reasoning in my own words. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of agency over my own life. For too long, I'd been living in response to other people's needs and expectations. I'd built my fortune thinking about how it would benefit my children, planned my golden years around their imagined presence in my life, made decisions based on what I thought would make them proud or happy or secure. Now, for the first time, since Marcus died, I was making choices based on what felt right to me, what aligned with my values, what would create the kind of legacy I actually wanted to leave behind. The drive home took me through Golden Gate Park, where families were enjoying the unseasonably warm weather. I watched children chase pigeons while their parents sat on benches, engaged and present, sharing snacks and stories and laughter. The scene made me think of my own children when they were young, how eager they'd been to share every small discovery, every minor triumph, every silly joke. When had that changed? When had I become someone they tolerated rather than someone they treasured? I thought about Diego, my sensitive artist son, who had once brought me drawings every day after school, proudly explaining each crayon mark and colored shape. He'd grown into a thoughtful, creative man, but our conversations now felt stilted, limited to surface-level updates about gallery showings and partner James's health. When had we stopped talking about art, about beauty, about the things that moved him? Carmen had been my little shadow, following me to the office on weekends, fascinated by the business world I navigated with increasing confidence. She'd asked endless questions about contracts and negotiations, about building relationships and solving problems. Now she was more successful than I'd ever been, but she seemed to view our interactions as networking opportunities rather than mother-daughter time. Isabella, my surprise baby, had been pure joy from the moment she arrived. She'd been curious about everything, affectionate beyond measure, quick to laugh and quicker to forgive. The Isabella who sat at my dining table on Saturday had been checking her watch, calculating how quickly she could fulfill her duty and return to her real life. Even Roberto, my serious eldest child, had once needed me desperately. He'd been the one to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, the one to seek my advice about everything from science fair projects to college applications. His success in medicine made me proud, but his emotional distance left me feeling like I'd raised a stranger. The house felt different when I returned that afternoon. Not emptier, but somehow cleaner, as if I'd swept away expectations that had been gathering dust in corners for years. I made myself a simple lunch and ate it in the breakfast nook, looking out at the garden Marcus and I had planted together in the early years of our marriage. The roses were still blooming, defying the season with their stubborn beauty. Marcus had always said roses were like love. They required attention and care, but they would thrive if you didn't take them for granted. I wondered what he would think of the decision I'd made that morning. Would he understand my disappointment, or would he encourage me to be more patient with our children? Marcus had been gone for 3 years, but I still found myself having conversations with him in my head, especially when I faced difficult decisions. He'd been my partner in every sense of the word, the person who'd supported my business ambitions when other husbands might have felt threatened, who'd shared parenting duties when other men of his generation left childcare entirely to their wives. "What do you think, mi amor?" I asked the empty air, using the pet name that had made him smile for 45 years. "Am I being too harsh?" The silence that answered felt different from the loneliness I'd experienced after Saturday's dinner. This was the comfortable quiet of a decision made with confidence rather than the hollow echo of disappointment. Over the following weeks, I found myself observing my interactions with my children through a new lens. Isabella called on a Wednesday evening, ostensibly to check on me, but really to ask if I could babysit the following weekend, because she and her husband wanted to attend a work function. The request itself didn't bother me. I loved spending time with my grandchildren. But the assumption that I would be available without prior notice, that my own plans were less important than their social obligations, rankled. "I'm sorry, mija," I said, using the endearment that had once felt natural but now seemed forced. "I have plans that weekend." The surprise in her voice was telling. "Oh, well, maybe another time. What are you doing?" "I'm attending a gala for the children's hospital. They're honoring volunteers who've given more than 20 years of service." There was a pause, as if Isabella was trying to remember whether she'd known about my volunteer work. "That's nice, Mom. Well, congratulations, I guess. Maybe we can get together soon." But we both knew soon was a flexible concept that might stretch indefinitely into the future. Carmen called a few days later with news about a major deal she'd closed, a commercial property sale that would net her company a 7-figure commission. She was excited, bubbling with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from her childhood achievements. For a few minutes, our conversation felt genuine, 2 women sharing professional victories. "I'm so proud of you," I told her, meaning it completely. "Your father would be thrilled to see how successful you've become." "Thanks, Mom. I learned from the best. You always said success was about persistence and treating people fairly." The moment felt precious, a glimpse of the relationship we might have had if we'd both made different choices along the way. But then Carmen's phone beeped with an incoming call, and the spell was broken. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I need to take this. It's Tokyo, and they've been trying to reach me all day. Can I call you back?" She never did call back. Roberto sent a brief email updating me on his patient load and mentioning that Sarah had been promoted to head of hospital administration. The message was warm but impersonal, the kind of update he might send to a professional acquaintance. There was no mention of their children, no questions about my health or happiness, no suggestion that we make plans to see each other. Diego was the only one who seemed to notice something had changed in my demeanor. During our monthly phone call, he asked if everything was all right, if I was feeling well, if there was anything he could do to help. His concern felt genuine, and for a moment, I considered telling him about my decision, about the pain that had prompted it. Instead, I assured him I was fine. asked about his latest art projects, and listened as he described a new exhibition he was curating. His voice came alive when he talked about art, about the way different pieces spoke to each other, about the stories they told individually and collectively. It reminded me of the little boy who had once created elaborate narratives to explain his finger paintings. "You sound happy, mijo," I told him, meaning it. "I am, Mama. James and I are thinking about expanding the gallery, maybe opening a second location. It's scary but exciting. Your father always said the best opportunities come disguised as risks. If it feels right to you, don't let fear hold you back." After we hung up, I sat in my office, looking at the family photographs that lined the shelves. 4 children who had once been my entire world, now scattered across the country, living lives that barely intersected with mine. I wondered if my new estate plan would change anything, if the shock of learning about their drastically reduced inheritance would prompt them to examine their relationship with me more honestly. More likely, they would be angry, hurt, confused. They might blame each other, or my age, or some imagined manipulation by gold-digging friends. They probably wouldn't consider that their own actions, or inactions, had influenced my decision. Patricia called in early November to schedule the final signing of the new will. The documents were ready, she explained, and she'd arranged for the proper witnesses and notarization. We also scheduled time to record the video statement I'd requested, a personal explanation of my reasoning that would accompany the legal documents. The night before the signing, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, remembering the life Marcus and I had built within these walls. The living room where we'd hosted dinner parties for my business associates and his medical colleagues. The kitchen where I'd taught all 4 children to make tamales for Christmas. The den where we'd watched countless movies as a family, the children sprawled on the floor while Marcus and I shared the couch. The memories weren't all perfect. There had been arguments and disappointments, teenage rebellions and parental mistakes, but they had been real, authentic, connected. The children who lived in these memories had loved me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They had sought my advice, valued my opinions, enjoyed my company. Those children had grown into adults who saw me as a duty rather than a joy, and that transformation was the source of my deepest grief. I stopped in front of the photograph on my office desk, the one taken when they were all still young enough to think I was the center of their universe. Roberto's serious expression, Carmen's gap-toothed grin, Diego's mischievous bunny ears, Isabella's infectious giggle. They had been my greatest achievement, my most important work. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd been so focused on being their mother that I'd forgotten to be myself, to cultivate relationships and interests that existed independently of their needs and schedules. Maybe I'd made them the center of my world so completely that when they created their own worlds, I was left with nothing but memories and expectations. The signing took place on a gray Tuesday morning that threatened rain but never delivered. Patricia had arranged for 2 witnesses, members of her staff who didn't know me personally, and could therefore provide objective testimony if the will was ever challenged. The process was surprisingly quick. Signatures, initials, formal declarations of mental competency and voluntary action. When it was finished, Patricia placed the original documents in her safe and handed me copies for my own records. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Relieved," I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living according to my own values, rather than trying to meet someone else's expectations. The video recording was more emotional. Sitting in Patricia's conference room, looking directly into the camera, I explained my decision in my own words, speaking directly to each of my children. "Roberto, you chose to save lives, and I'm proud of the doctor you've become. But you forgot that your mother is also a life worth saving. From loneliness, from irrelevance, from feeling invisible in her own family. Carmen, you built an empire, and I admire your strength and determination. but you built walls around your heart that I could never seem to climb. Diego, you create beautiful things that move people's souls, but you stopped trying to move mine. Isabella, you gave me the gift of grandchildren, but you gave me so little of yourself that I barely know who you've become. I paused, collecting my thoughts before continuing. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it to honor the people and causes that have made me feel valued and appreciated in my later years. The Children's Hospital volunteers who remember my birthday. The scholarship recipients who send thank you notes and graduation announcements. The food bank clients who smile when they see me and ask about my week. The most difficult part was explaining that this wasn't about money, but about relationship, about presence, about the difference between being loved and being tolerated. You'll inherit enough to know that I thought of you, but not enough to replace the emotional inheritance you chose not to claim. My greatest wealth was always my love for you, but love that goes unreciprocated eventually finds other places to flourish. When the recording was finished, I felt drained but also strangely peaceful. I'd said what needed to be said, made the decisions that felt right, created a legacy that reflected my actual values rather than my imagined obligations. Driving home through the city I'd called home for 50 years, I noticed things I'd been too distracted to see before. The way afternoon light filtered through the fog rolling in from the bay. The diversity of people on the streets, each carrying their own stories and struggles. The small acts of kindness between strangers. A man helping an elderly woman with her groceries, teenagers giving up their bus seats, a barista adding extra whipped cream to a child's hot chocolate. The world was full of connection and compassion, I realized. I'd just been looking for it in the wrong places, expecting it from people who had already given me what they thought they owed, and moved on to other priorities. That evening, I called Maria and asked if she'd like to have dinner together the following weekend. Not because I needed help with anything, but because I enjoyed her company and wanted to hear about her grandchildren's latest adventures. Senora Elizabeth, that would be wonderful, she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. I'll make my famous enchiladas. You always say they're almost as good as your mother's. They're better than my mother's, I confessed, laughing. But don't tell her spirit I said that. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to a family dinner. One where I would be appreciated, where conversation would flow naturally, where no one would check their phone or make excuses. To leave early? Sometimes, I was learning, family is less about blood than about choice, less about obligation than about affection, less about history than about presence. My children had made their choices, and now I was making mine. The rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall as I prepared for bed, a gentle shower that would nourish the roses in the garden and wash the dust from the air. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new relationships, new ways of being in the world that didn't depend on anyone else's validation or attention. I was 75 years old, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, and finally free to live, according to my own desires rather than my children's expectations. It had taken me 7 decades to learn that the most important relationship I could cultivate was the one with myself, but I was grateful to have learned it at all. Some inheritances, I was discovering, were meant to be kept rather than given. The months that followed the signing of my new will brought an unexpected lightness to my daily existence. With the weight of disappointed expectations finally lifted from my shoulders, I found myself rediscovering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for years. It was as if I'd been holding my breath for decades, waiting for my children to acknowledge my worth, and now I could finally exhale. December arrived with its usual San Francisco chill, the kind of weather that made my bones ache but also reminded me that I was still very much alive. The Children's Hospital had asked me to help coordinate their annual holiday party for the young patients, and I threw myself into the project with enthusiasm I hadn't felt since my business days. Working with the other volunteers, I discovered something remarkable. People who chose to spend time with me rather than feeling obligated to do so. Margaret Chen, a retired teacher in her 80s, had become something of a mentor despite being barely older than me. She possessed a sharp wit and an irreverent sense of humor that made even the most challenging tasks enjoyable. "Elizabeth," she said one afternoon as we sorted through donated toys, "you seem different lately. More present, if that makes sense. Like you've stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world." Her observation struck me as profoundly accurate. I had been apologizing, in subtle ways, for years. Apologizing for wanting my children's time, for expecting their interest, for hoping they might value my company as much as I valued theirs. Now, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted to be there, I felt no need to apologize for anything. The holiday party itself was a revelation. Watching children who were facing serious medical challenges laugh and play with pure joy reminded me of what really mattered in life. Their parents, many of whom were younger than my own children, treated me with a respect and warmth that felt genuine rather than performative. One mother, whose 6-year-old daughter was recovering from heart surgery, sought me out specifically to thank me for the comfort items I'd provided for the pediatric ward. "Sophia keeps talking about the lady with the pretty scarves who reads stories," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "You made such a difference during the scariest time of our lives." In that moment, I felt more valued than I had in any interaction with my own family in years. This stranger saw me clearly, appreciated my contributions, and took the time to express her gratitude. The contrast with my children's casual dismissal of my efforts was stark and painful, but also liberating. Christmas came and went with the usual round of obligatory phone calls and hastily chosen gifts exchanged via mail. Roberto sent a generic gift basket from an expensive store. Carmen's assistant ordered flowers that arrived with a card bearing her printed signature. Diego at least chose something personal, a small watercolor painting he'd created himself, though it arrived 3 days late. Isabella sent a digital photo frame loaded with pictures of her children, most of which I'd never seen before. I reciprocated, with carefully chosen gifts that reflected my knowledge of their interests and personalities, but I no longer invested emotional energy in hoping for meaningful responses. The lack of enthusiasm in their thank you calls no longer surprised or hurt me. I'd found my peace with the reality of our relationship. New Year's Eve found me at a small dinner party hosted by Dr. Janet Williams, my physician who had become a dear friend over the years. The gathering included an eclectic mix of people: retired professionals, artists, academics, and community activists. The conversation ranged from local politics to travel stories to philosophical discussions about aging and legacy. "I've been thinking about reinvention," announced Gloria Vasquez, a former city council member who was now in her 80s, "not changing who I am, but discovering who I am when I'm not defined by other people's expectations." Her words resonated deeply with my own recent journey. For too long, I'd defined myself primarily as a mother, allowing that role to overshadow every other aspect of my identity. The successful businesswoman, the community volunteer, the lifelong learner, the woman who appreciated art and literature and good conversation. All of these facets of my personality had been relegated to secondary importance while I waited for my children to need me. "What does reinvention look like at our age?" asked Dr. Williams, genuinely curious. "Freedom," I found myself saying, surprising everyone with my certainty. Freedom to pursue relationships that nourish rather than drain you. Freedom to invest your energy in causes that appreciate your contributions. Freedom to stop trying to earn love from people who've already decided you're not worth the effort. The room fell quiet for a moment, not with discomfort, but with recognition. Every person at that table had lived long enough to understand the weight of unreciprocated investment, whether in relationships, careers, or dreams that never materialized. Margaret Chen raised her wine glass in a toast to the freedom that comes with accepting reality instead of fighting it. We all raised our glasses, and I felt a sense of belonging that had been missing from my life for years. These people saw me as I was, intelligent, accomplished, worthy of respect and friendship, rather than as a role I was failing to fulfill adequately. January brought an unexpected opportunity. The university where I'd earned my business degree decades earlier reached out about establishing an endowed chair in entrepreneurship, specifically focused on women starting businesses later in life. The development office had heard about my success and wondered if I might be interested in contributing to such a program. The conversation with Dean Patricia Morrison was energizing in ways I hadn't experienced since selling my company. She spoke passionately about the challenges facing older women entrepreneurs, the lack of resources and mentorship available to them, the societal assumptions that innovation was a young person's game. We envision a program that would provide not just funding, but mentorship, networking opportunities, and practical support for women over 50 who want to start their own businesses, she explained during our meeting in her campus office. Your story could inspire so many women who think it's too late to pursue their dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was an institution recognizing the value of my experience and expertise, wanting to build something lasting around my contributions. While my own children couldn't be bothered to ask about my life beyond the most superficial pleasantries, I agreed to fund the program with a $5 million endowment, money that would have otherwise gone to children who already had more opportunities than they knew what to do with. The Elizabeth Flores Center for Women's Entrepreneurship would support dozens of women each year, providing them with the resources and encouragement I'd had to find on my own decades earlier. The announcement made the local business section of the newspaper, a small item that generated surprising interest. I received calls from former colleagues, business associates, and women I'd mentored informally over the years. Each conversation reminded me of the professional identity I'd almost forgotten in my focus on family relationships. One call particularly moved me. Sandra Rodriguez, who had been my assistant during the early years of my company, tracked down my number to express her gratitude for the opportunities I'd provided her. She was now running her own medical supply company in Los Angeles, directly inspired by her experience working with me. "Mrs. Flores, you probably don't remember, but you used to let me sit in on client meetings even though it wasn't part of my job. You explained the business strategies, answered my questions, treated me like someone whose opinions mattered. That experience changed my entire trajectory." I did remember Sandra, remembered her quick mind and genuine interest in understanding how business worked, but I'd had no idea that my informal mentoring had been so influential in her career development. "You were always asking thoughtful questions," I told her. "I could see you had the mind for business. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. I hope my own children appreciate what an amazing role model they have in their grandmother," she said. And for the first time in months, someone's words about my role as a mother didn't sting. February brought a health scare that put my new perspective to the test. During a routine mammogram, the radiologist found something suspicious that required additional imaging and ultimately a biopsy. The week of waiting for results was the longest of my life since Marcus's final illness. I told no one initially, not wanting to worry people unnecessarily before I knew what we were dealing with. But as I sat in medical waiting rooms, surrounded by other women facing similar uncertainties, I realized how isolated I'd become from the people who were supposed to be my closest support system. The biopsy results were benign, thank God, but the experience forced me to confront my own mortality in ways I'd been avoiding. I was 75 years old, statistically closer to the end of my life than the beginning, and I was facing health scares alone because I no longer trusted my children to respond with the care and attention I needed. That realization prompted me to make another call to Patricia Hernandez. I wanted to add a healthcare directive to my estate planning, designating Dr. Williams as my primary medical decision-maker rather than defaulting to my eldest child. Roberto was a doctor, but he was also someone who might make decisions based on medical protocol rather than my personal wishes and values. "This is wise," Patricia agreed when I explained my reasoning. Medical decision-making should be entrusted to someone who truly knows your values and will advocate for your preferences, not just follow standard procedures. The conversation led to a broader discussion about end-of-life planning, something I'd been avoiding since Marcus's death. I arranged for a living will that specified my preferences for life-sustaining treatment, organ donation, and funeral arrangements. I also established a fund to ensure that Dr. Williams and several close friends could travel to attend my services, regardless of their financial circumstances. It was sobering to plan for my own death, but also empowering. These decisions reflected my values and relationships as they actually existed, not as I wished they were. The people I designated as my healthcare proxies and funeral coordinators were the ones who had shown genuine care for my well-being, not the ones who shared my DNA but treated me as an afterthought. Spring arrived early that year, with cherry blossoms blooming throughout the city in March instead of April. I decided to celebrate by taking the European river cruise I'd been considering since Marcus died. For years, I'd postponed travel plans, always hoping my children might want to join me or visit during times when I might be away. The cruise through the Rhine Valley was everything I'd hoped for, and more. My fellow travelers were an interesting mix of couples and singles, retirees and empty nesters, people who had chosen to prioritize experiences over material accumulation. The daily excursions to castles and vineyards provided opportunities for conversation and connection that felt natural and unforced. I roomed with Eleanor Murphy, a widow from Boston whose children lived scattered across the country. Like me, she'd reached a point where she stopped organizing her life around their schedules and started pursuing her own interests. We bonded over shared experiences of well-meaning but emotionally distant adult children and the liberation that came with accepting that reality. "My daughter keeps saying I should move closer to her family," Eleanor confided one evening as we watched the sunset from the ship's deck. "But when I visit, I feel like I'm intruding on their real life. They're polite but busy, including me, in activities out of duty rather than desire. I'd rather live independently and see them occasionally than be a burden they feel obligated to manage." Her words perfectly captured my own feelings about my children's sporadic invitations and suggestions. They wanted to be good children in theory, but they lacked the emotional bandwidth or genuine interest to be good children in practice. Accepting that reality was painful, but ultimately freeing. The cruise also provided perspective on my financial situation and the choices I'd made about my estate. Many of my fellow travelers were comfortable but not wealthy, people who had worked hard and saved carefully but didn't have unlimited resources for luxury experiences. They appreciated every meal, every excursion, every moment of beauty we encountered. Their gratitude reminded me of the impact my charitable giving would have on people who truly needed support. The nursing students who would receive full scholarships, the food bank clients who would have access to nutritious meals, the sick children who would be treated in a beautiful, well-equipped facility. These were people who would treasure the opportunities my money could provide. My children, by contrast, already had comfortable lives, successful careers, and financial security. The millions they wouldn't inherit would have been nice to have, but weren't necessary for their well-being or happiness. They might be disappointed or angry when they learned about my revised will, but they wouldn't be harmed by the decision. The cruise concluded with a farewell dinner where passengers shared highlights from their journey and exchanged contact information. Several people specifically sought me out to say how much they'd enjoyed my company, how much they'd learned from my business stories, how they hoped we could stay in touch. "You have such a gift for making people feel heard and valued," said Eleanor as we hugged goodbye. "Your children are lucky to have you as a mother." I thanked her for the kind words, but didn't have the heart to explain that my children didn't seem to feel particularly lucky about our relationship. Instead, I focused on the genuine connections I'd made with people who appreciated my company without needing to be convinced of my worth. Returning home from the cruise, I felt energized and optimistic about the future in ways I hadn't experienced in years. The house that had felt so empty and echoing now felt spacious and full of possibilities. I could fill it with new friends, interesting projects, meaningful activities that brought me joy rather than disappointment. I called Diego a few days after returning, hoping to share some of my travel experiences with the child who had always been most interested in art and culture. He listened politely as I described the museums and architectural treasures I'd visited, but his responses felt perfunctory rather than engaged. "That sounds really nice, Mama," he said when I finished describing a particularly beautiful cathedral. "I'm glad you had a good time. Listen, I need to tell you that James and I probably won't be able to make it down for Easter this year. We have a major exhibition opening that weekend, and we can't afford to be away from the gallery." The disappointment was familiar but no longer devastating. "Of course, mijo. Business comes first. I understand." But I did understand, perhaps more clearly than Diego realized. I understood that I would always rank below their professional obligations, their social commitments, their personal convenience. I understood that our relationship existed at their discretion, subject to cancellation whenever something more important came up. I also understood that I was finally free from the expectation that things would be different, that they would suddenly prioritize our relationship, that they would wake up one day and realize how much they'd been taking me for granted. Easter came and went quietly, with a lovely brunch shared with Dr. Williams and Margaret Chen and several other friends who had become family by choice rather than birth. We talked about literature and politics and travel plans, laughed at shared jokes and memories, enjoyed each other's company without checking phones or making excuses to leave early. This was what family was supposed to feel like, I realized. This warmth, this genuine interest in each other's lives, this sense that everyone at the table was valued and appreciated. This was what I'd been trying to create with my children for years, not understanding that it couldn't be forced or manufactured through special occasions and elaborate preparations. May brought another opportunity for perspective when Isabella finally called to check in, weeks after promising to call soon. She was dealing with stress at work, problems with childcare, marital tensions related to her husband's frequent travel. I listened sympathetically, offered what support and advice I could, and found myself falling back into the familiar pattern of emotional caretaking. But something was different this time. While I genuinely cared about Isabella's well-being and wanted to help her navigate her challenges, I no longer felt responsible for fixing her problems or carrying the emotional weight of her stress. I could offer support without sacrificing my own peace of mind. "Mom, you're so good at listening," she said near the end of our conversation. "I should call you more often." "You should call me when you want to, not when you feel you should," I replied, surprising both of us with my honesty. Obligatory phone calls don't help either of us feel better about our relationship. There was a pause, as if Isabella was trying to decide whether to be offended or curious about my unexpected directness. "Is everything okay? You sound different." "Everything is fine. I'm just learning to be honest about what I need from relationships instead of pretending to be satisfied with whatever scraps of attention people are willing to offer." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you saying I don't pay enough attention? To you?" "I'm saying that attention given out of guilt or obligation doesn't feel good to receive, and it probably doesn't feel good to give either. We can both do better, or we can accept that we have different expectations for this relationship." The conversation ended shortly after that, with Isabella clearly unsettled by my new approach to family dynamics. I felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sad that honesty felt so foreign in our relationship, but relieved to finally stop pretending. That surface-level contact was sufficient to maintain meaningful connection. June brought the first anniversary of Marcus's death, a milestone I'd been dreading for months. The grief was still sharp, but it was complicated now by the realization that losing him had forced me to confront the superficiality of my other closest relationships. He had been my true companion, the person who saw and appreciated every aspect of my personality. Without him, I'd had to learn to value myself enough to seek that kind of authentic connection elsewhere. I spent the anniversary at his gravesite, bringing flowers and talking to him about the changes I'd made in my life over the past year. I told him about the new will, about the charitable commitments, about the friends who had become my chosen family. I told him about my disappointment in our children, but also about my growing peace with accepting them as they were, rather than hoping they would become what I needed them to be. "I think you'd be proud of me," I said to his headstone, running my fingers over the carved letters of his name. "I'm finally living for myself instead of waiting for other people to decide I'm worth loving." The wind rustled through the trees above his grave, and for a moment, I could almost feel his presence, his approval, his love. Marcus had always encouraged me to value myself, to demand the respect and consideration I deserved. It had taken me 75 years and his death to fully embrace that lesson, but I was grateful to have learned it at all. Summer stretched ahead with possibilities that excited rather than daunted me. I had travel plans with my new friends, volunteer commitments that felt meaningful, projects that engaged my mind and skills. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to the future, instead of mourning the past or trying to change people who had no interest in changing. My children would discover my revised will eventually, probably not until after my death, unless health crises forced earlier conversations about my estate. When that day came, they would have to confront the consequences of treating their mother as an afterthought rather than a priority. They would have to live with the knowledge that I had found other people and causes more deserving of my resources and affection. That realization would hurt them, probably deeply. But perhaps it would also teach them something valuable about love, attention, and the importance of appreciating people while they're still alive to know they're valued. Or perhaps they would simply be angry and move on, adding my posthumous rejection to the list of grievances they would carry into their own old age. I couldn't control their response any more than I could control their behavior while I was alive. What I could control was how I spent the years I had left, and I intended to spend them surrounded by people who chose to love me, rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. I intended to use my resources to support causes that appreciated my contributions rather than children who took them for granted. I was 75 years old, wealthy, healthy, and finally free to live according to my own values and desires. It was, I was discovering, a beautiful way to be in the world. September arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, marking 2 years since that devastating family reunion that had changed everything. I stood in my garden, deadheading the roses that had bloomed prolifically all summer, thinking about how much my life had transformed since that painful afternoon when my children had treated me like an inconvenience rather than their mother. The morning routine I'd developed over the past months brought me deep satisfaction. Coffee in the breakfast nook while reading the newspaper, not checking my phone for messages that rarely came. A walk through the neighborhood, greeting other early risers who had become familiar faces. Time in the garden, tending to plants that responded to care with beauty and growth. These simple pleasures no longer felt like consolation prizes for a disappointing family life. They felt like genuine contentment. Dr. Williams had scheduled my annual physical for early October, and I approached it with the kind of calm confidence that comes from taking excellent care of oneself. My blood pressure was better than it had been in years. My cholesterol levels were optimal, and I'd maintained my weight without the stress eating that had plagued me during the worst periods of family disappointment. "You're in remarkable health. For 75, Dr. Williams commented as she reviewed my test results. "Whatever changes you've made in your lifestyle are clearly working." I stopped trying to manage other people's emotions, I told her honestly. It's amazing how much energy that frees up for taking care of yourself. She laughed, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. As a physician, she'd observed countless patients whose health suffered from family stress, relationship disappointments, and the exhaustion that comes from giving more than you receive. The conversation turned to advance directives and long-term care planning, topics I'd once avoided because they seemed too depressing to contemplate. Now I discussed them matter-of-factly, grateful to have friends like Janet who would advocate for my wishes, rather than children who might prioritize their own convenience or guilt over my actual preferences. "Have you talked to your children about your care preferences?" she asked, a question that once would have sent me into spirals of anxiety about their reactions. My children have demonstrated that they're not particularly interested in difficult conversations about my needs, I replied calmly. I've made arrangements with people who are. October brought an invitation that surprised and delighted me. The university's business school wanted to host a symposium celebrating the first year of the Elizabeth Flores Center for Women's Entrepreneurship, and they hoped I would be the keynote speaker. The event would feature presentations from program participants, panel discussions with successful women entrepreneurs, and networking opportunities for women considering starting their own businesses. I spent weeks preparing my speech, not because I was nervous about public speaking. Decades of business presentations had cured me of that anxiety, but because I wanted to share something meaningful about the relationship between risk, reinvention, and the courage to pursue your own vision regardless of age or circumstances. The symposium was held in the university's newest auditorium, a beautiful space with excellent acoustics and natural light that made everyone look their best. The audience included students, faculty, local business leaders, and women ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, all united by entrepreneurial ambition or curiosity. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces turned toward me with genuine interest and respect, I felt a kind of fulfillment that had been missing from my interactions with my own family. These people valued my experience, wanted to learn from my successes and failures, saw me as someone whose opinions mattered. Entrepreneurship at any age requires the courage to bet on yourself, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. But entrepreneurship later in life requires something additional, the wisdom to distinguish between what other people expect of you and what you expect of yourself. I spoke about starting my medical supply company in my 40s, when conventional wisdom suggested I should be focusing on my children's needs rather than my own ambitions. I discussed the challenges of building credibility in a male-dominated industry, the importance of surrounding yourself with people who believe in your vision, and the satisfaction that comes from creating something valuable through your own efforts. But I also spoke about the deeper entrepreneurship of recreating your identity when life doesn't unfold according to your expectations. Sometimes the most important business you can start is the business of living authentically, regardless of whether that authenticity aligns with other people's comfort or convenience. The audience was engaged throughout, laughing at my stories about early business mistakes and nodding knowingly when I described the isolation that sometimes comes with pursuing unconventional paths. During the question and answer session, their questions were thoughtful and specific, demonstrating that they'd been listening carefully and wanted to apply my insights to their own situations. One young woman asked about balancing entrepreneurial ambitions with family expectations, and I found myself giving advice that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Family members who truly love and support you will find ways to encourage your dreams, even if those dreams make them uncomfortable, I said. Family members who only love you when you're convenient will try to make you feel guilty for prioritizing your own growth. Learning to tell the difference is one of the most important skills you can develop. After the event, dozens of people approached me with business cards, follow-up questions, and expressions of gratitude for my honesty about the complexities of pursuing success on your own terms. Several women my age specifically thanked me for demonstrating that reinvention was possible at any stage of life. I've been afraid to start my consulting business because my adult children think I should be slowing down and focusing on grandchildren, confided Maria Santos, a retired teacher who had developed innovative curriculum materials. but listening. Do you talk about authenticity versus expectations? I realize I've been letting their comfort matter more than my own fulfillment. These conversations energized me in ways that family gatherings never had. Here were people who saw my experience as valuable, my insights as worth considering, my choices as inspiring rather than inconvenient. The local business journal ran a feature story about the symposium and my role in supporting women's entrepreneurship. The article included a photograph of me speaking at the podium, looking confident and engaged, surrounded by an audience that was clearly paying attention. When I saw the image, I was struck by how different I looked from the woman who had sat alone at her dining room table 2 years earlier, surrounded by the remnants of an unappreciated family meal. This woman, the woman in the photograph, looked like someone who knew her own worth and didn't need external validation to feel valuable. This woman looked like someone who had important things to say and people who wanted to hear them. November brought Thanksgiving, a holiday that had once filled me with hope and anxiety in equal measure. I'd stopped hosting family dinners, finally accepting that my elaborate preparations were more appreciated by me than by their intended recipients. Instead, I accepted an invitation to join Dr. Williams and her extended family for their celebration. The Williams family gathering was revelatory in its ordinariness. 3 generations gathered around a table that could barely contain all the dishes, talking over each other with the kind of comfortable chaos that indicates genuine affection. No one checked their phones during dinner. No one made excuses to leave early. No one treated the gathering as an obligation to be endured rather than enjoyed. Janet's elderly mother held court at one end of the table, telling stories that everyone had heard before, but still laughed at because they loved the storyteller. Her grown children asked about her health, her hobbies, her opinions on current events, not out of duty, but out of genuine curiosity about her thoughts and experiences. Watching their interactions, I finally understood what I'd been missing. In my own family dynamics, the Williams family members seemed to actually like each other, not just love each other out of biological obligation. They chose to spend time together, chose to engage with each other's lives, chose to prioritize the relationship over competing demands. "Elizabeth, we're so glad you could join us," said Janet's daughter Sarah, refilling my wine glass. "Mom talks about you all the time. She says you're one of the most interesting people she knows." The warmth in her voice was genuine, not the polite courtesy I'd grown accustomed to from my own children. These people welcomed me not because they had to, but because they wanted to, and that difference was profound. During dessert, Janet's mother asked about my own family, and I found myself giving an honest answer for the first time in years. "My children are all successful and healthy, which is what every parent hopes for," I said carefully. "But we've grown apart over the years. They're busy with their own lives, and I'm learning to build a fulfilling life that doesn't depend on their participation." There was no judgment in the faces around the table, only understanding. Several people nodded knowingly, and Janet's brother mentioned his own struggles with adult children who seemed to have little time for family relationships. "It's one of the hardest things about getting older," said Janet's mother. "You spend decades putting your children first, and then you have to learn how to put yourself first when they move on to their own priorities." Her words validated something I'd been afraid to admit even to myself, that feeling disappointed by my children's emotional distance wasn't selfish or unreasonable. It was a natural response to investing deeply in relationships that hadn't grown to meet my evolving needs. December brought an unexpected development that tested my newfound emotional equilibrium. Roberto called with news that he and Sarah were getting divorced, and he wondered if he could visit for a few days while he figured out his next steps. His voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was a child, and my maternal instincts immediately activated. "Of course, mijo," I said without hesitation. "This is your home. Come whenever you need to." He arrived 3 days later, looking older than his 49 years and carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from emotional rather than physical strain. For the first time in years, he seemed to actually see me when we embraced, as if his own crisis had temporarily cleared away the distractions that usually kept him emotionally distant. Over the following week, we had conversations that reminded me of the close relationship we'd once shared. Roberto talked about the gradual breakdown of his marriage, his guilt about prioritizing his career over his family relationships, his fear that he'd repeated patterns he'd learned from watching his own parents navigate the challenges of dual careers and family obligations. "I look at my teenage children, and I realize I barely know them," he confessed one evening, as we sat in the living room where he'd once done homework while I worked on business plans. "I've been so focused on providing for them financially that I forgot to be present emotionally." Sound familiar? The question stung because it was fair. Marcus and I had been busy building our careers and providing for our family, and we'd sometimes prioritized financial security over emotional availability. But we'd also made intentional efforts to create family traditions, to be present for important moments, to show our children that they mattered beyond their achievements. "Your father and I made mistakes," I acknowledged. "But we also made your childhood a priority in ways that you haven't experienced as an adult. You've treated family relationships as something to manage around your career rather than something to integrate with your career." Roberto was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. "You're right. I've been thinking about family as something that would always be there, waiting for me to have time for it. I didn't realize that relationships require ongoing investment to survive." This conversation felt more real than any interaction we'd had in years. Roberto wasn't just updating me on his life or fulfilling an obligation to check in with his mother. He was seeking genuine advice, sharing authentic emotions, and acknowledging that our relationship mattered to him. For a week, I glimpsed the man my son could be when he wasn't hiding behind professional achievements and social obligations. He helped with household tasks without being asked, joined me for meals without checking his phone, asked thoughtful questions about my life and activities. He even came with me to my volunteer shift at the Children's Hospital, where his medical expertise was genuinely appreciated, and his presence felt like a gift rather than a duty. But as his emotional crisis stabilized and he began making plans for his new living situation, I watched him gradually retreat back into his familiar patterns of emotional distance. The phone calls resumed, the distracted responses returned, the sense that he was already mentally moving on to more important concerns. I wasn't surprised, but I was sad. The week had shown me who Roberto could be as a son, as a person, when he chose to be fully present in his relationships. It had also shown me that his emotional availability was conditional on his own needs rather than mine. When he left to return to Los Angeles and begin rebuilding his life, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Grateful that he'd trusted me enough to seek support during his crisis. Sad that crisis seemed to be required for him to remember that I existed, as more than an obligatory phone call. Proud that I'd been able to help without losing myself in his problems the way I might have in the past. January marked the beginning of my third year living according to my own values rather than my children's expectations. The transformation felt complete now. Not a work in progress, but a fundamental shift in how I understood myself and my place in the world. I'd accepted leadership of the hospital's Capital Campaign Committee, a position that utilized my business skills and connections while supporting a cause I cared deeply about. The work was challenging and meaningful, requiring strategic thinking, relationship building, and project management skills I'd honed during my entrepreneurial years. My fellow committee members treated me as a valuable colleague whose opinions mattered, whose experience was relevant, whose contributions were essential to our success. We were raising money to build the new pediatric wing that would eventually be funded primarily by my estate, though none of them knew about that connection. The irony of working to raise money that I'd already committed to donating wasn't lost on me, but it also felt appropriate. I wanted to be personally involved in ensuring that the wing was designed and built according to the highest standards. that it would truly serve the needs of sick children and their families. During one committee meeting, as we reviewed architectural plans and discussed features that would make the space more family-friendly, I thought about the legacy I was creating through this work. Long after I was gone, children would be healed in beautiful, well-equipped rooms. Families would find comfort in thoughtfully designed spaces. Medical staff would have the tools and environment they needed to provide excellent care. This legacy felt more meaningful than any inheritance I could have left my children. Money would be spent, invested, or saved, but it wouldn't necessarily make the world better. This pediatric wing would serve countless families, creating positive impact that would compound over generations. February brought another health appointment, this time with a cardiologist who wanted to follow up on some minor irregularities Dr. Williams had noticed during my annual physical. The tests revealed that I had developed atrial fibrillation, a heart rhythm disorder that was common in people my age, but required ongoing monitoring and medication. "It's very manageable," Dr. Amanda Foster assured me as she explained the treatment plan. Many people live normal, full lives with this condition. The important thing is taking your medication consistently and watching for symptoms that might indicate complications. I listened carefully to her instructions, asked relevant questions about diet and exercise modifications, and scheduled follow-up appointments without feeling panicked or overwhelmed. Having this diagnosis felt like receiving important information, rather than a devastating blow, perhaps because I'd already made peace with my own mortality and arranged my affairs according to my actual relationships rather than my imagined ones. I told Dr. Williams about the diagnosis during our next appointment, and she helped me understand how to integrate this new medical reality into my overall health management plan. I also told Margaret Chen and a few other close friends, wanting them to be aware in case I experienced symptoms while we were together. What I didn't do was call my children immediately to share the news. This decision wasn't made out of spite or punishment, but out of recognition that their responses would likely cause me more stress than comfort. Roberto would shift into medical professional mode, overwhelming me with technical information and treatment recommendations. Carmen would worry about how my health might affect her own schedule and responsibilities. Diego would be genuinely concerned but wouldn't know how to be helpful. Isabella would add my diagnosis to her list of things to worry about without having the emotional bandwidth to provide meaningful support. Instead, I chose to process this health development with people who had demonstrated their ability to be present during difficult times, people who would offer appropriate concern without making my medical condition about their own fears or inconvenience. This choice reflected how thoroughly my perspective on family relationships had evolved. I no longer felt obligated to include my children in every aspect of my life, simply because they were my children. I included people in my personal challenges based on their ability to be helpful, supportive, and genuinely caring rather than their biological connection to me. March brought the second anniversary of the will revision that had set my transformation in motion. I marked the date quietly, reflecting on how different my life had become since that decision to stop living for other people's approval and start living for my own fulfillment. The woman who had signed those legal documents 2 years earlier had been angry, hurt, and desperate for her children to recognize her worth. The woman I had become was confident, connected, and focused on relationships that nourished rather than depleted her. I no longer waited for my phone to ring with calls from my children. I no longer made elaborate plans hoping they would choose to participate. I no longer measured my worth by their attention or defined my happiness by their approval. Instead, I had built a life filled with people who valued my company, activities that engaged my mind and skills, and purpose that extended beyond my own immediate family. I had learned the difference between being loved and being tolerated, between being valued and being managed. The financial legacy I would leave my children remained unchanged, $50,000 each, and an explanation of why they would receive no more. But the emotional legacy had evolved into something more complex. I was no longer leaving them a lesson about their failures as children. I was leaving them an example of what it looked like to live authentically, to prioritize genuine relationships over obligatory ones, to find meaning and purpose regardless of other people's expectations. Whether they would learn from that example or simply resent it was beyond my control. But I was finally at peace with the knowledge that their response to my choices was their responsibility, not mine. Spring arrived with the usual burst of new growth in the garden, and I spent my mornings tending to plants that responded predictably to care and attention. The roses that had struggled for years were now thriving, perhaps because I was finally giving them the consistent, patient nurturing they required rather than the sporadic, anxious attention I'd once provided. Like my relationships, my garden had improved once I stopped trying to force unnatural outcomes and started working with the conditions that actually existed. Some plants flourished with minimal intervention. Others required more attention, but rewarded that attention with extraordinary beauty. A few had to be removed entirely because they were taking resources from healthier growth. As I worked among the flowers that morning, I thought about the year ahead and the possibilities it held. More travel with friends who enjoyed my company. Continued involvement with organizations that valued my contributions. Deeper relationships with people who had chosen to love me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. At 76, I was finally living the life I'd always wanted. Purposeful, connected, and free from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. The phone rang as I was finishing my gardening, and I saw Roberto's name on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering. Not because I was angry, but because I was happy and didn't want to risk that happiness being diminished by another perfunctory conversation. But then I realized that my happiness was no longer fragile enough to be threatened by my children's emotional limitations. I could accept their calls or decline them based on my own needs and energy rather than their expectations or my guilt. I answered the phone with genuine curiosity about what my eldest son might have to say. Roberto's voice carried an unusual urgency that immediately caught my attention. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come over this afternoon?" There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't another casual check-in or request for emotional support during his ongoing divorce proceedings. This sounded more serious, more deliberate, and I found myself curious rather than apprehensive about what might prompt such directness from my usually reserved eldest son. "Of course, mijo. I'll be here all afternoon." He arrived 2 hours later, but he wasn't alone. Carmen had driven up from Los Angeles, and Diego had made the trip from Portland. Isabella pulled into my driveway just as the others were getting out of their cars, creating an unprecedented gathering that hadn't occurred since that disastrous family reunion 3 years earlier. Watching them walk toward my front door together, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing actors preparing for a performance rather than my own children arriving for an unexpected visit. Their body language suggested serious purpose, the kind of unified determination that indicated they'd been planning this intervention for some time. "This is quite a surprise," I said as I welcomed them into the foyer. "Should I be concerned about whatever brings all 4 of you here at once?" Carmen stepped forward, assuming her typical role as family spokesperson. "Mom, we need to discuss some things that have been worrying us. We've been talking, and we think there might be some issues we need to address together." I led them into the living room, noting how they arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the chair where I typically sat. The formation felt deliberate, almost confrontational, and I wondered what revelations or accusations were about to emerge from this clearly orchestrated gathering. "We've been noticing changes in your behavior over the past few years," Roberto began, his voice carrying the professional tone he used with difficult patience. "Changes in your social patterns, your decision-making, your interactions with family. We're concerned that you might be experiencing some cognitive decline." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt a flash of anger at his presumption. But beneath the anger was something more complex. A recognition that this conversation revealed far more about their perceptions than about my actual mental state. "What specific changes are you referring to?" I asked calmly, genuinely curious about what behaviors they found concerning. Carmen consulted notes she'd written on her phone, as if she were presenting a business case rather than discussing her mother's well-being. "You've become increasingly isolated from family. You've made financial commitments without consulting us. You've been spending time with people we don't know. You seem to have forgotten conversations we've had and events we've shared." Diego shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly less convinced than his siblings about the wisdom of this confrontation. "Mama, we're just worried about you. Living alone in this big house, making decisions without talking to anyone, it seems like you might need more support than you're getting." Isabella nodded in agreement, though her expression suggested she was following her siblings' lead rather than expressing her own genuine concerns. "We think it might be time to consider some changes, maybe moving somewhere with more supervision, getting some help with daily decisions, having people around who can keep an eye on things." The picture they were painting gradually became clear. They believed I was suffering from dementia or some other form of cognitive impairment that was affecting my judgment and behavior. They'd interpreted my emotional independence as mental decline, my choice to prioritize different relationships as social isolation, my financial decisions as evidence of incompetence. Most telling of all, they'd apparently forgotten or dismissed the conversations and interactions that didn't fit their narrative. The meaningful discussion Roberto and I had shared during his divorce crisis. The business symposium where I'd delivered a coherent, well-received keynote address. The volunteer work that required complex planning and execution. The new friendships that demonstrated my continued ability to form meaningful relationships. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully. "But I'm curious about something. When you say I've forgotten conversations and events we've shared, can you give me specific examples?" The four of them exchanged glances, and Carmen referred back to her phone. "Well, there was the family reunion 3 years ago. You seemed confused about our plans, upset when we had to leave for other commitments, like you'd forgotten that we'd told you about our schedules." Roberto nodded in agreement. "And there have been times when we've called to check on you, and you've seemed distant or uninterested in talking, like you didn't recognize the importance of staying connected with family. You stopped hosting holiday dinners without explanation," added Isabella. "And when we've invited you to visit or suggested activities we could do together, you've seemed uninterested or made excuses about being too busy with other things." Diego's contribution was gentler, but equally misguided. "You've talked about selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, which seems like a big decision to make without input from family. And you've been spending money on charities and causes without discussing whether that's the best use of your resources." As I listened to their litany of concerns, I realized we were experiencing the same events through completely different lenses. What they interpreted as cognitive decline, I recognized as emotional growth. What they saw as social isolation, I knew was selective relationship building. What they characterized as poor judgment, I understood as deliberate choices aligned with my values. The most painful revelation wasn't their misunderstanding of my mental state. It was their complete lack of awareness about the quality of our actual relationship. They'd forgotten their own behavior at that family reunion, their distracted attention during our interactions, their consistent prioritization of other commitments over family time. They'd rewritten history to cast themselves as caring children worried about an increasingly impaired mother, rather than acknowledging their role in creating the emotional distance they now found concerning. "I want to make sure I understand your perspective," I said slowly. "You believe that my decision to build relationships with people who value my company, to make charitable commitments that reflect my values, and to stop organizing my life around your convenience indicates mental impairment?" Carmen's expression tightened with frustration. "Mom, you're proving our point. You're not seeing the situation clearly. We're trying to help you, and you're responding defensively instead of recognizing that we have valid concerns." "What we're suggesting isn't punishment," Roberto added in his most professional tone. "There are excellent facilities that provide the kind of support and supervision that would help you maintain your independence while ensuring your safety and well-being." The word facilities clarified their intentions completely. They weren't just concerned about my mental state, they were planning to have me declared incompetent and placed in managed care. They'd convinced themselves that my refusal to live, according to their expectations, was evidence of cognitive decline rather than evidence of personal growth. I thought about Patricia Hernandez, my estate attorney, who had found my reasoning clear and legally sound when I revised my will. I thought about Dr. Williams, who had pronounced me in excellent health and sharp mental condition. I thought about the university administrators who had trusted me with a keynote address and the hospital committee that had elected me to leadership positions. All of these people interacted with me regularly and found me competent, engaging, and mentally acute. But my own children, who barely knew me anymore, had decided that my failure to conform to their preferences indicated mental illness. "I think we need to pause this conversation," I said, standing up from my chair. "I want you all to sit here and think carefully about something while I make a phone call." I walked to my office and dialed Dr. Williams' emergency line, explaining that I needed her professional opinion about a family situation that had just emerged. She agreed to come over within the hour to provide an independent assessment of my mental state and cognitive function. Returning to the living room, I found my children whispering among themselves, clearly strategizing about how to handle my resistance to their intervention. Their behavior reminded me of business competitors trying to outmaneuver an opponent rather than family members concerned about a loved one's well-being. "Dr. Williams is coming over to conduct a cognitive assessment," I announced. "Since you're concerned about my mental state, I assume you'll want an objective, professional evaluation rather than relying on your own observations." Roberto looked surprised by this development. "Mom, that's not necessary. We're not questioning your medical care. We're questioning your judgment about social and financial decisions." "My social and financial decisions are directly related to my cognitive function," I replied. "If you believe I'm making poor choices due to mental impairment, then we should establish whether that impairment actually exists." Carmen's expression suggested she was reconsidering the wisdom of this confrontation. "We don't need to involve outsiders in family decisions. We can work through this ourselves." Dr. Williams isn't an outsider. She's been my physician for over a decade, and she knows me well enough to provide an accurate assessment of any cognitive changes. If you're genuinely concerned about my mental health, you should welcome professional evaluation. The hour that followed was uncomfortable for everyone. My children clearly hadn't expected their intervention to be subjected to medical scrutiny, and they seemed increasingly uncertain about their position as we waited for Dr. Williams to arrive. When she appeared at my door, Dr. Williams carried the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of medical practice. She greeted my children politely but professionally, making it clear that she was there in her capacity as my physician rather than as a family friend. "Elizabeth has asked me to conduct a cognitive assessment to address some concerns that have been raised about her mental state," she explained to the group. "I'll need to speak with her privately for the evaluation, and then I'll share my findings with all of you." The assessment took place in my office, where Dr. Williams conducted a thorough examination of my memory, reasoning ability, problem-solving skills, and emotional state. She asked detailed questions about recent events, tested my recall of complex information, and evaluated my understanding of social and financial concepts. "Elizabeth, your cognitive function is entirely normal for someone your age," she said when the formal testing was complete. "Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is clear, and your emotional responses are appropriate to your circumstances. There's no evidence of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair your judgment or decision-making ability." We returned to the living room, where my children waited with expressions ranging from hopeful to apprehensive. Dr. Williams delivered her assessment with the same professional clarity she brought to all medical consultations. "I've conducted a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, and I can tell you definitively that your mother is in excellent mental health. Her memory, reasoning ability, and judgment are all well within normal ranges for her age. There's no medical evidence to support concerns about cognitive decline or impaired decision-making." The silence that followed her pronouncement was profound. Roberto looked stunned, as if his medical training had convinced him that his observations were more reliable than they apparently were. Carmen appeared frustrated, clearly uncomfortable with having her conclusions contradicted by professional expertise. Diego seemed relieved, perhaps because he'd been the least convinced about the intervention from the beginning. Isabella looked confused, as if she wasn't sure how to process information that contradicted the narrative her siblings had constructed. "But what about the behavioral changes we've observed?" Carmen asked, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "The social isolation, the financial decisions, the resistance to family input." Dr. Williams smiled with the kind of patience she typically reserved for family members who were struggling to accept difficult diagnoses. "Those aren't symptoms of cognitive decline. Those are choices made by a competent adult who has decided to prioritize different relationships and activities than she has in the past. People's social preferences often evolve as they age," she continued. "They may choose to spend time with people who share their current interests, rather than maintaining relationships based solely on historical connection. They may decide to use their resources in ways that reflect their values rather than other people's expectations. These are signs of emotional maturity, not mental impairment." Roberto shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps recognizing that his professional credentials hadn't protected him from making a significant diagnostic error. "So, you're saying there's nothing wrong with Mom? That all these changes are just personal choices?" "I'm saying that your mother is a mentally competent adult who has every right to make decisions about her social life, her finances, and her living situation without input from anyone else," Dr. Williams replied firmly. "The fact that you disagree with her choices doesn't make those choices evidence of cognitive decline." After Dr. Williams left, my children sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to reconcile their assumptions with the reality of my confirmed mental competence. The intervention they'd planned had not only failed, but had revealed the extent to which they'd misunderstood both my mental state and my motivations. "I think we owe you an apology," Diego said finally, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "We were so convinced that something was wrong that we didn't consider that you might be making conscious choices we just didn't understand." Isabella nodded, in agreement, tears gathering in her eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. We thought we were helping, but I can see now that we were being presumptuous and hurtful." Roberto and Carmen remained silent, perhaps still processing the implications of their mistake, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that their concerns had been unfounded. "I appreciate the apologies," I said calmly, "but I think this situation reveals something more significant than a simple misunderstanding about my mental health. You were willing to have me declared incompetent and placed in managed care rather than consider that I might have valid reasons for living differently than you expected." The weight of that accusation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They'd been prepared to take away my autonomy, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life, all because I'd chosen to prioritize relationships and activities that didn't include them. "We weren't trying to take away your independence," Carmen protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "We were trying to ensure your safety and well-being. By removing my right to choose where I live, how I spend my money, and who I spend time with," I replied. "You were trying to solve the problem of my not living according to your preferences by making it impossible for me to live according to my own preferences." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. For the first time in years, we spoke honestly about our relationship, about their expectations and my disappointments, about the gulf that had grown between us and the resentment it had created on both sides. Roberto admitted that he'd been treating family relationships as something to manage around his career, rather than something to prioritize alongside his career. Carmen acknowledged that she'd expected me to be available for her convenience without offering the same availability in return. Diego confessed that he'd been avoiding difficult conversations about our relationship because he was afraid of conflict. Isabella recognized that she'd been treating me more like a service provider than a person with my own needs and feelings. The hardest part, I told them as the afternoon wore on, wasn't that you were busy or distracted or focused on your own lives. The hardest part was that you stopped seeing me as a person worthy of genuine interest and attention. I became a duty to discharge rather than a relationship to nurture. "We never meant to make you feel that way," Isabella said, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. "I know you didn't mean to," I replied, "but impact matters more than intention. And the impact of your behavior was that I felt invisible in my own family, tolerated rather than treasured." As the sun began to set, painting the living room in golden light that reminded me of happier family gatherings from years past, we talked about the possibility of rebuilding our relationships on more honest foundations. Not relationships based on obligation or guilt, but relationships based on genuine mutual interest and affection. "I don't know if that's possible," I told them honestly. "Too much has happened, too much trust has been eroded. But I'm willing to try if you're willing to do the hard work of actually getting to know me as I am now, rather than trying to make me into who you think I should be." Roberto was the first to commit to making changes. "I want to understand what your life looks like now, what brings you joy, what you've learned about yourself in the past few years. I realize I've been thinking about you as frozen in time when you were raising us, instead of recognizing that you've continued growing and changing." Carmen's response was more tentative but seemed genuine. "I'm not sure I know how to have a relationship that isn't based on managing logistics and solving problems. But I'd like to learn if you're patient with me while I figure it out." Diego's commitment felt the most authentic. "I want to spend time with you not because I'm supposed to, but because I want to. I want to hear about the volunteer work you're doing, the friends you've made, the things that make you excited about getting up in the morning." Isabella's response surprised me with its emotional honesty. "I've been so focused on managing all the demands in my life that I forgot to appreciate the people who love me. I don't want to look back and realize I missed the chance to really know my mother because I was too busy being a dutiful daughter." The promises they made that evening might have felt empty if they'd been offered 3 years earlier, when I was desperate for any sign of their affection and attention. But now, having built a fulfilling life independent of their approval, I could receive their commitments with cautious optimism rather than desperate hope. We talked until well past dinner time, ordering takeout and continuing conversations that touched on topics we'd avoided for years. Not everything was resolved, and not every hurt was healed, but we made progress toward understanding each other as adults rather than relating to each other through outdated roles and expectations. When they finally prepared to leave, my children hugged me with an intention and warmth that had been missing from our interactions for years. The physical affection felt different too. Not the brief, obligatory contact of duty, but the lingering embrace of people who genuinely cared about each other. "Thank you for not giving up on us," Roberto said, as he prepared to drive back to Los Angeles. "We almost lost something precious because we were too caught up in our own assumptions to see clearly." After they left, I sat in my quiet house, processing the emotional whirlwind of the day. The intervention they'd planned had backfired spectacularly, but it had also forced us to confront truths about our relationship that might have remained buried for years longer. I thought about the will I'd revised 3 years earlier, the document that would leave them each $50,000 and the bulk of my estate to charitable causes. That decision had been made from a place of hurt and anger, a response to feeling unloved and unappreciated by people who were supposed to value me above all others. But the conversations of this day had revealed something I hadn't expected. My children's behavior hadn't been motivated by lack of love, but by lack of awareness. They'd been so absorbed in their own lives, so confident that I would always be available when they needed me, that they'd stopped paying attention to what I needed from them. Their assumption that I was suffering from cognitive decline had been profoundly hurtful, but it had also been genuinely motivated by concern for my well-being, rather than desire to control my resources. They'd been wrong, dramatically and harmfully wrong, but they hadn't been malicious. The question now was whether this newfound understanding would translate into lasting changes in our relationship, or whether we would gradually drift back into old patterns once the drama of today's confrontation faded into memory. Over the following weeks, I was surprised by the consistency of their efforts to rebuild our connections. Roberto called twice a week, not to update me on his problems or ask for advice, but to ask about my activities and share stories from his own life. Carmen visited for a weekend, spending time touring the children's hospital where I volunteered, and meeting some of the friends who had become important to me. Diego drove down from Portland specifically to attend one of my committee meetings, wanting to understand the work that had become so central to my sense of purpose. Isabella began, including me in family activities not as a babysitter, but as a grandmother whose presence was genuinely desired rather than merely tolerated. These changes felt tentative at first, as if we were all testing whether authentic relationship was possible after years of going through the motions of family connection. But gradually, I began to trust that their interest was genuine rather than temporary, motivated by affection rather than guilt. The most significant change was in how they spoke to me and about me. Instead of treating me as someone whose opinions were irrelevant to important decisions, they began asking for my perspective on their challenges and choices. Instead of assuming they knew what was best for me, they began asking what I wanted and needed from our relationships. 3 months after their failed intervention, I made an appointment with Patricia Hernandez to discuss revising my will once again. The decision wasn't easy. Part of me worried that changing my estate plan in response to their improved behavior would send the message that love could be purchased, or that my affection was conditional on their attention. But ultimately, I realized that holding on to anger and punishment when circumstances had genuinely changed would be as unfair as their original assumption that I was mentally incompetent. People deserved the chance to grow and change, and relationships deserved the opportunity to heal when both parties were willing to do the necessary work. The new will maintained substantial charitable giving, the children's hospital, the nursing scholarships, the food bank, and the women's entrepreneurship center would still receive the bulk of my estate, but I increased each child's inheritance to $5 million, enough to provide significant security while still reflecting my commitment to causes beyond my immediate family. More importantly, I recorded a new video message to accompany the will, one that acknowledged their efforts to rebuild our relationships while explaining my continued commitment to charitable giving. "My dear children," I said, looking directly into the camera, "by the time you see this, I hope you'll understand that love isn't measured only in dollars left behind, but in relationships nurtured while we're still alive to enjoy them. You've shown me in recent months that it's possible to value each other authentically, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine affection and respect. The charitable giving in this will reflect values we've come to share, the importance of supporting people who need help, of investing in education and healthcare, of leaving the world better than we found it. I hope you'll see these gifts not as money taken away from you, but as a family legacy of service and generosity that you can continue in your own lives." On my 77th birthday, my children surprised me by organizing a celebration that reflected their new understanding of what I actually enjoyed. Instead of a formal dinner party that would require elaborate preparation and create pressure for everyone to perform happiness, they arranged a casual gathering at the children's hospital where I volunteered. The party included my fellow volunteers, some of the medical staff I'd worked with over the years, and even a few families whose children had been helped by programs I'd supported. It was exactly the kind of celebration I would have chosen for myself, meaningful, connected to my values, and focused on relationships that brought me genuine joy. Watching my children interact comfortably with my chosen family, seeing them appreciate the work that had become so important to me, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't experienced since Marcus died. This was what I'd always wanted, not perfect children, who never made mistakes, but adult children who were willing to grow, to acknowledge their errors, and to prioritize our relationship enough to put in the effort required for authentic connection. The speech Roberto gave that evening brought tears to my eyes. Our mother taught us that success isn't just about what you achieve professionally, but about what you contribute to the world and how you treat the people you love. We lost sight of that lesson for a while, but she never stopped living it. We're grateful not just for everything she's given us, but for everything she's shown us about what it means to live with purpose and integrity. As I looked around the room that night, surrounded by people who had chosen to love me and children who had finally remembered how to love me authentically, I realized that my story had found its true ending. Not the bitter conclusion I'd once imagined, where selfish children discovered too late what they'd lost through their neglect, but a more complex and ultimately more satisfying resolution where mistakes were acknowledged, forgiveness was offered, and relationships were rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and genuine affection. The money would still go largely to charity when I died, because that remained consistent with my values and would do more good in the world than simply enriching people who were already financially secure. But my children would inherit something more valuable than money: the knowledge that they were truly loved, that their mother had seen them clearly and forgiven their mistakes, and that family relationships could be repaired through honest communication and sustained effort. Sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't financial security, but the example of what it looks like to live according to your values, to demand authentic relationship, and to believe that people can change when they're motivated by love rather than obligation. My children had almost lost their inheritance through their emotional neglect, but they'd ultimately earned something more precious through their willingness to grow. And I had discovered that the most important legacy I could leave wasn't the money I'd accumulated, but the relationships I'd nurtured and the values I'd lived by every day. In the end, we'd all learned that family isn't just about biology or obligation, but about choice, effort, and the daily decision to see each other clearly and love each other authentically. It had taken us decades to learn that lesson, but knowledge is worth waiting for, especially when it comes wrapped in the possibility of redemption and the promise of genuine connection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.